Good morning, church. I have a hot take I want to start with right away that I think a lot of you are going to disagree with, but that's okay, and here it is, that I think the average consumer needs to stop complaining about the price of eggs. Some of you are thinking, this guy's got to be yoking, right? I'm not. I get it. I know the prices have gone up a lot, and for those of you who are in industries that affects, like, this isn't for you, but this is for the average consumer. Just want to come back a little bit and ask, like, how many eggs are you going through in a week, really? 1 dozen, maybe 2 dozen at your house, and so you know that you are complaining and freaking out over maybe about $3 to $4 of a difference from a couple of years ago, which isn't that big of a deal. Plus, here's the real reason. You're complaining when things have gotten bad, but where were you when things were good in the egg world? I really believe that for the past couple of decades, prior to 2020, that the second greatest value in America behind the TSA pre-check line, which is not as good of a value anymore, believe it or not, after many of you finally did something your pastor asked you to do. And now you're gumming up my lines there. But anyway, I believe that prior to 2020, the second greatest value in all of America was the price of a dozen eggs. I mean, what were we paying? $1.50 or $2? I mean, we're talking like 10 to 15 cents an egg. What a value. I actually have charts to show you how good of a value this is. The first is from the United States Bureau of Labor. Check it out. You'll see different foods on here, and you'll notice the brown line is the one at the very bottom that tells you the price and the value of how much eggs have gone up until 2019. There's a second chart that you need to see, though, that actually talks about for all of the inflation, when you actually bring inflation into the mix, check out how the price of eggs have gone down since 1890. Look at that. That's incredible value. I think we've been doing highway robbery on the egg industry for decades. And so when things were good, were you praising the egg makers and the egg marketers and the egg sellers? No, you weren't. And so I actually don't think there was an avian flu. I think it's a conspiracy. I think the egg makers got together and realized we've been giving them a deal for a century, and they haven't recognized it, and so all the egg prices, they've been ignoring us for a while, and so we give up, we're exhausted, and so prices have soared. And we've lost our minds. And you might be thinking, especially if you're new here, why are we spending 3 minutes on eggs? It's a very valid question, by the way. Because I think Americans, I think Omahans, I think we're funny. I think we can fixate on little things when if you peel the whole thing back, we are like so much richer collectively than we've ever been before. And we'll freak out about a couple of dollars, maybe a week, that this might actually cost us, and then we'll spend several dollars a day going through our coffee drive-thrus. We'll have countless monthly subscriptions that many of them we don't even use. And for some of us, like to literally get in our front door, we've got to walk through a maze of Amazon boxes to get in. You know what I'm talking about. By the way, before I actually tell you what I want to talk about today, I do want to go on record because I don't want to get emails. I don't actually believe there was conspiracy. Avian flu is a real thing as far as I know. And so I don't think like egg marketers got together and did all of that. But anyway, my point, we're at a level of prosperity in our nation and in our city, but I don't feel like it's resulting in the lives that we thought it would. I think many of us are buying into something that we thought would bring us fulfillment, but it's actually leaving us empty. It feels like there's a better way or maybe a different truth for us to live by. That's what I want to talk about today. I want to do 3 things in my message today. Number 1, in part 1, I want to talk about the truth that the world offers us, especially here in the Western world or in America. I want to talk about the truth of the world. And I actually want to use a lot of that to then build into part 2, which is where really we're going to get into the meat of what the Bible says and what Jesus says. So today we're going to kind of use apologetics to build into the Word of God, which we'll dive deep into in part 2. And so we'll look then at the truth of Jesus. So part 1, truth of the world. Part 2, truth of Jesus. And then part 3 is like we got a choice to make. And I want to get really practical and talk about what we can do and how we can apply what we're learning today. And so first, in part 1, the truth of the world. So what is the truth of the world that many of us are buying into? It's this statement right here, that the more you have, the happier you will be. So is this truth true? Let's find out. While I have some subjective opinions and anecdotal evidence that I could share, I actually want to lean way more objective in here. And I want to look at some statistics and studies and quotes as evidence to line up if this is true or not. I'm grateful for the work of Pastor John Mark Comer in his book. He's talked a lot about this called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. This may be one of my favorite books of the past couple of years. If you haven't read it, you should. It's awesome. So I'm grateful for his work. So the more you have, the happier you will be. Is that true? And is there ever a time where like you can get enough? I wonder. There was once a man that owned 1% of the entire wealth of the U.S. economy. Puts guys like Musk and Bezos and Buffett and Gates to shame. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and at one point, reportedly, it was on record that someone asked him, how much money is enough? And he responded, just a little bit more. Just a little bit more. This guy, especially inflation adjusted, is by far the wealthiest man that's ever existed in our nation. He's the world's first billionaire, and he says just a little bit more. And yet, despite knowing this wisdom, or I would say getting this warning from him, Americans are still like totally going for all of it. The French sociologist Jean Baudrillard has made the point that in the Western world, materialism has become the new dominant system of meaning. Atheism hasn't replaced cultural Christianity, shopping has. And I could share with you 50 statistics about this. I've got about 7 or 8. First is this, that the average American home, not the rich, I'm talking average median of the bell curve, has 300,000 items in it. How crazy that you've likely got more than 250,000 items at your house right now. Today, Americans consume twice the amount of material goods that we did just 5 decades ago. In that same time frame, the average American home has nearly tripled in size, going from 900 to 2,500 square feet, even though our family size has about been cut in half, which if you do the math, that means we have about 6 times the imprint or square footage of a person 5 decades ago. And despite all of that space to live, work, and be comfortable and play in our homes, did you know that 25% of people that have 2-car garages don't have space to park either car in garages due to clutter? Another 32% don't have space for one of their cars. In 2018, did you know that 90% of the world's storage facilities existed here in the United States of America? And we can see around the city, at least, these things are still popping up everywhere. A recent study found that there is an average of 6 to 7 square footage for every American in these storage units, which means we could literally sleep our entire nation in our storage units. Let's get more personal. Nebraskans, even with our garages and our basements, which let's be honest, basements are just an opportunity for more clutter to be in our homes. We are averaging 8 square feet per person. So if you hear anything else, hear that you are above average today. A couple more, not to mention with all of this going on, mortgage debt excluded, the average debt of an American last year is $17,051, which isn't healthy, nor the effects of all of this consumption and buying and using that it's having on our planet, and let alone those who are poor in the developing nations that are making a lot of the materials that we possess. Last one, there was an article a few years ago written by Forbes magazine that says the average American today is 90 times richer. Average American, 90 times richer than the average historical human being. Crazy. In the 1920s, Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers wrote this: "We must shift America from a needs culture to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. And in the last 100 years, things have progressed. And so now we're at the point where we see 5,000 to 10,000 advertisements a day. And this mentality, this quote, is the same reason why you want a new iPhone every September, even though the one that you have works perfectly fine. But it doesn't have the 17th camera on it, Zach. I've only got 848 gigabytes. I need 16 more. Your desires are overshadowing your needs. Richard Foster's written a lot on spiritual disciplines, and he says that we in the West are guinea pigs in one huge economic experiment in consumption. So, the more you have, the happier you will be. So, I bet if we were to poll Americans today, we would just be filled with levels of joy and satisfaction and happiness and overall well-being that would be off the charts. I mean, we're 90 times richer than the average historical human being, right? I'm sure our well-being is crushing, and I'm sure the more that you make, the happier that you are. Does that really happen? Does stuff and money and accumulation buy happiness for all of our materials? Are we any better for it? I think we can see that this experiment that we're in, for all the research and data is coming back with a very big answer, no, with one caveat, that it is very fulfilling and does provide happiness when a family moves out of poverty. That does bring fulfillment. But once out of poverty, the research and data show there is no amount of things and possessions and money that you can have in this world that will fill you up. Which is what Baylor professor Robert C. Roberts says, upward mobility often ends not in satisfaction and peace, but in exhaustion, disappointment, and emptiness. And if that's too scholarly of a quote for you, there was a rapper, Notorious B.I.G., that one time said, "Mo money, mo problems." The happier you'll be, the more you have, is a byproduct of the American dream. And yet we're seeing the charts and the statistics and the data don't show we're happier, we're living lives of fulfillment or joy. Instead, what they show is the exact opposite of this. Despite the insane amount of collective prosperity we have in our nation, you look at charts now and you'll see things like burnout, exhaustion, emptiness, loneliness, depression, and anxiety at record highs. If you want to get more personal and look at our city, you've heard of Barna, this research company, doing a citywide study that's going to come out later officially this year with data. And some of the new data is in already. And they say a couple of things that jump off the page to me that I've shared before. Number one, the good news is that more Omahans believe in Jesus than the national average. It's 67% of Omahans believe that Jesus is the answer. But when you go further into the data of all the studies they've ever studied so far, they have seen that levels of overall well-being and satisfaction and happiness in life for Omahans are far below any other city. Which tells me something's wrong. Something's got to change. This truth maybe isn't quite true. Maybe it's a lie. Maybe we were created for something more. Maybe the American dream that many of us are chasing can't and never will give us what we most need or desire. One more quote from sociologist Robert Wuthnow. He says, "We live in a materialist culture, and we want money and possessions. And very few people have heard a powerful voice telling them to resist those impulses or how to resist those impulses. Organized religion has not done a good job of challenging people to examine their lifestyles." So has organized religion, has the collective church failed in this regard? I think collectively the answer is yes. If I do assert my own experience, for me personally, I think the collective church and organized religion has done a fairly adequate job talking about giving or tithing, which is giving 10%. Like we do a lot of talk about how to give 10%, and that tithe is meant to be, wow, God, you've been so good to me and you provide for me, and so I trust in you, and so I'm giving my first fruits, my first 10% to your work. I'm going to do it through the local church because that's what you asked, because we're going to represent you to our community and beyond. And so there's the 10%. I think we've done a really good job talking about what to do with the 10%. I think we've really failed in telling you what to do with the other 90%. And if we're 90 times historically richer than the average historical human being, then in that 90%, there is crazy margin that can do a lot of good and can do a lot of harm. And I think so far we've been way more on the harm side of things. So part one, truth of the world. The more you have, the happier you will be. What if there was another option? I'm glad you asked. Part two is the truth of Jesus. And here's the option that Jesus offers. Everything you need, you already have in Jesus. Come on, let's say that together. Everything you need, you already have in Jesus. Now let's get personal. Let's substitute you with I. Come on, say it. Everything I need, I already have in Jesus. Whew. That feels good. Amazingly, Jesus talks so much about money and possessions. It's estimated that 25% of his teachings have something to do with finance. I was listening to a sermon by Pastor Timothy Keller yesterday, and he said that for as much as we struggle with lust in our world today, and that was a struggle back then too, did you know that in the red letters of Jesus that he talks at least 10 times more about greed than he does lust? What? Why? Because money is on people's minds. To quote my second rapper of the day, Snoop Dogg, who once said, "I've got my mind on my money and my money on my mind." Thankfully, we're going to get into the words of Jesus now. If you have your Bibles, turn to Luke 12. We're going to be looking primarily at verses 13 to 21, and if you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens. And so to give you a little bit of context, Jesus is teaching with a crowd here, and he's just taught about the high value that human beings have in God's eyes. And then verse 13 comes. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me to be a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." So right after teaching about the value of God, the value that we have to God, a man interjects and asks Jesus to take his side in a financial dispute. Now, we don't know a lot of the context of the dispute going on, but we know that in those days, like it was typical for the older brother to get 2/3 of the inheritance and the younger brother to get 1/3 of the inheritance. And so maybe that was at play here. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is Jesus didn't feel like he needed to enter in and get specifics and be an arbiter and a judge between them. Rather, he wasn't interested in the details of what they were wanting or needing, but he could see right to the man's heart. And rather than engaging in a debate that would have a solution, Jesus went right to his heart and said, "Be on your guard against greed. Life doesn't consist in an abundance of possessions," which is the opposite of the truth of the American dream. The more you have, the happier you'll be. Jesus says, no, that's not what life is about. And to drive home his point further, he now tells a parable, which is just a story meant to illustrate a truth. Verse 16. He told them this parable: the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. The rich man thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." So likely up to this point, he's not only had the blessing of God on his fertile ground, but he's probably had to work very hard to get to where he is, to get to where he has now in excess, an abundant harvest, right? We know how the world works. We know how agriculture to an extent works, that God supplies the rain and the sunlight and everything that the crops need to grow. But at the end of the day, even with all of the farming advances and technological advances, like you can look at a list of some of the most taxing, hard jobs even still today, and you will see farming on that list. It is hard work to produce a harvest. harvest. So you have God giving you what you need, but it's also hard work. And there's the man. He's had God's provision. He's had God's blessing, but he's put in the work. And now he's got so much that he doesn't know what to do with his extra. And he lives in a day where he doesn't have storage facilities every single 12 streets in Omaha. So what's the answer? He said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. I'll invent the storage industry, he says. And then I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. The man has a plan. He's confident. I'll build bigger barns to store everything, and then I'll just live off the excess. I'll eat, I'll drink, and I'll be merry. And then when other people look at me, they will think, what a success story I am. The man lives without a care in the world. How much better can it get than that? But notice, if you look at the man's words, he turns God's blessing and God's provision into this selfish, me-centric answer. Did you notice? My barn, my crops, my grain. And while God does give us things, whenever we make them more about us and not about Him, we're going to run into problems. When those resources start turning inward and we stop looking outward for how we can use what God's given, the ridiculous blessing and provision that He's provided, that's when we're going to run into problems, which is what happens in verse 20. God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. The man's thinking, people are going to look at my life and think what a success story I am. And God says to him, you're a fool. And by the way, the Greek word for fool there is not like a clumsy or sort of whimsidaisical, silly type of fool. It's anti-intellectual type of fool. He's calling him stupid, dumb. That's a dumb way to live. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. That's a dumb, stupid way to live your life. And it's going to get taken from you. And then who's going to even be able to get the excess that you worked so hard for? Another time, Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Haven't you noticed that to be true? If you've done any investing, like in a company, like you've never cared about that company before, but the moment your dollars go to that company, you're like watching. You're hoping they do well. I've noticed this in my own life. I remember when we moved to Florida to plant a church in 2010, we bought our home, and we were really excited about our home. It was a great neighborhood, and the guy that owned it before us, it was meticulous and clean, and that was part of the selling point for us, is we accumulated, I would say, a yard of the month quality caliber yard. And like, I don't need my yard to be yard of the month, but I just want to keep up, with everybody. I don't want to be the worst on the street. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know much about how to maintain, but I put a lot of time and effort and money. I bought a mower. I was doing all the things. Here's the reality, though. In Florida, nobody told me that you have to spray your yard for pest control. Otherwise, these little critters will come in and they will completely destroy your yard. And what happens is once somebody else sprays their yard, the critters leave and they'll move to the next closest place where the spray has not happened. And so I inherited a yard of the month quality that in 3 months I had completely killed. And I blame everybody in Florida for that, because they should have told me that this is what you need to do. And you know what happened? I got turned into the HOA. I'm paying my $125 a month, but the HOA got a hold of this, and they sent me a letter that says you got 3 months to put new sod in, and so I spent thousands of dollars on dirt and grass. And after I spent thousands of dollars on dirt and grass, do you want to know where my heart went? Everybody else's yard better keep up and maintain with mine, or I'm turning them in. My treasure went in dirt and grass, and so there my heart was too. I want to back up and be clear in this message. It's not bad to be rich. It's not wrong. It's not bad to have a lot of possessions. I think actually that's God's blessing for you. But the moment our hearts are more in the created things rather than the Creator, that's when problems come. The moment we begin to trust in what we have and look to that for our happiness, not only will we find that living for created things will never fill us like we think they will, it also means at the same time we're going to miss out on the purpose for what life is really about. It's a dumb way to live. And anytime we aren't living for the purposes of God, intellectually it's foolish and there's something better. And so this is the gospel, that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, you don't actually need to accumulate. You don't need to earn. You don't need to add. You don't need to do. You don't need to chase anything. You don't need to climb any ladder, because your identity does not come from those things. Rather, your identity comes through the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross and through the tomb that says, I've given you grace to live in this world, grace that will last eternity, and grace that now gives you a purpose to live in this world for something so much better than what many of you are settling for. Jesus one time said that you cannot serve two things, both God and money. I would fast forward and tell you today that you cannot serve both the American dream and the gospel of Jesus. They are at odds with one another. They do not play with one another. It's not wrong to have things, but it is wrong when created things come before the Creator. And that's what this man was all about. My stuff, my barns, my grain. He lost sight of what life is really about. And Jesus says, intellectually, that's foolish. So you've got the truth of the world. The more you have, the happier you'll be. You've got the truth of Jesus. Everything you have, you need, you already have in Jesus. So then Jesus invites us into this practice called simplicity. The Apostle Paul would summarize Jesus' teachings on money and possessions like this in 1 Timothy 6. Command those who are rich in this present world. And by the way, when I say command those who are rich, I'm not talking about upper class. I'm talking everyone in this room, 90 times the average richer than the historical human being. So let me make that clear. This is upper, middle, and I would even say much of lower class is involved in this too. Command them not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but instead to put their hope in God, who richly provides us everything for our enjoyment. So he does provide things for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds. So when God provides for us, we do good with those things. We do rich in good deeds, and we're generous, and we're willing to share. And Paul says in this way, they'll lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life, which implies that there is a life that is not really life. This is the life that is truly life. It's not about an abundance of possessions and putting our hope and trust in those. It's about trusting in the finished work of Jesus and not settling for anything else. Because here's what we have. The truth of the world, I really believe, leads to complexity. And the truth of Jesus leads to the way of simplicity. So how does your life feel? Does it feel simple? Or does it feel complex? Here's what I've noticed. Most human beings long for simplicity. They want that. But then they choose complexity. Now, the reason you desire simplicity is because God put that desire in you. The simple truth of resting and trusting in the finished work of Jesus. That's a godly desire. But the reason you choose complexity is because without intention, the Western world and the American dream has a strong gravitational pull that will get you. And it's just going to lead to more and more complexity. Because when you focus on possessions in this world, then you'll start seeing what everybody else has, and you'll start logging onto social media accounts and looking at your friends and influencers that have more than you do, and you'll feel like, you're losing your step, and you start misplacing your identity, and then you get so consumed in the rat race and feel like you got to do more to keep up with the Joneses. And even when you keep up with the Joneses, as we said earlier, there's never anything that you can have that is finally enough. It's never enough. You're never fully satisfied, and so just a little bit more, and that leads to complexity. It's why you fill your calendars, and then again later in the week, like, why did we put that on there? It's why you buy stuff thinking that it will fill you, and maybe it does provide you with a dopamine hit that's really nice in that temporary time, but in the end will not fill you. It'll only leave you empty and exhausted because you'll realize, I've got all this stuff now, I got to get more stuff, and now I got to spend all my hours and my days actually just taking care of my stuff, cleaning, shining, organizing my stuff, and it's never enough, and now my lifestyle has been upgraded, so now I got to keep progressing at work to keep up with my ridiculous lifestyle, and all of this just adds to complexity and exhaustion and getting really tired. And intellectually, God says, it's foolish, when there's a better truth that you can live the simple life of receiving everything I want to give and doing your best to give that away. John Mark Comer defines simplicity like this: intentionally living with less to make space for what we most value before God. This is what we ought to do with the 90%. Not everything in our power to keep up and win, but rather, Paul says, be rich in good deeds, be generous, be willing to share, stand out, and say, I could do this, I could get that thing, I could have that vacation, I could invest in this, right? Or I could not. And I can honor Christ and trust daily that he'll give me what I need. So I want to encourage you. I got a challenge I'll tell you in just a second about simplicity, but two things simplicity is not. Number one, simplicity is not organizing. Organizing sometimes, if we're honest, just allows us to get more materials because we've cleaned it up and we have space for one more item. That's not simplicity. Number two, simplicity is not a virtue. So you can practice simplicity and still remain obsessive, unloving, and still be a jerk, right? Practices are means by which we say yes to the invitation Jesus has, but they are not the end game. The end game is to be so satisfied in Christ that I want nothing more to be like him. And simplicity simply helps you get to that. And so my challenge is to practice simplicity. Now, my confession before I tell you what we're going to do this week is I need this message as much as you do today. Not only would I claim not to be an expert in simplicity, I'm a repeat offender of the very things I've been telling you what to do. And I need to repent of that. I think if someone were to look at my life, they could probably say, you've done really well with the first 10%, maybe even the next 40. But man, I feel there's a lot of wiggle room in that second 50% for me. To be more generous, to trust in God more. A couple weeks when we asked for sponsoring Hope Chest families, like I know I can find wiggle room. I can cancel one monthly subscription I don't use and change a child's life. So hear me that I am one in training, and I'm pulled. I'm in the world, and I know I'm 39 and I feel like I'm in the prime of my career and I got to provide for my family. And so these are my earning years, and so I got to do my best, and I see what other people have, and I want those possessions, and I want those things, and I want those comforts, and I crave good food and nice vacations and chase entertainment. I do all of that. And sometimes I do way up to more than I want to admit, place my comfort and my trust in the created things more than the Creator, and I'm sorry. I'd rather live by knowing that everything I already have has been given to me, and take risks with my generosity, that it might change more lives than just my family who's already in a good place because of what Christ has done. And so I want to challenge you to practice simplicity. It's not a mandate, it's an invitation, again, to follow the way of Jesus. And so here's the challenge this week. Take at least one of your possessions that you don't need but you are emotionally attached to, and get rid of it. Now, you've got 300,000 items likely to choose from. So maybe you'll do more than one. Throw it away. Even better, sell it. Best, be generous. Give it away. Share it. Donate it. Do it and watch and feel how that thing that you're emotionally attached to, when you give it to somebody else, stirs your heart in a good way. And find fulfillment in it. And if you like that one challenge. John Mark Comer's made a PDF of what it would look like to do a 4-week simplicity challenge that I would urge you to scan that QR code right now. We'll keep it up for another 30 seconds or so. And if you're like, oh, that was fun to do the one thing, I want 4 weeks of feeling that good, then that's for you there. But this is the invitation we have, to build our very lives on the foundation of Christ. And friends, he's worth it. Amen? Let's stand and let's sing.